The Last of Us is a media franchise that exists both as a video game and an HBO series. The story takes place 20 years after a global catastrophe devastates the human population. We follow an older man named Joel and a young girl named Ellie as they travel across the ruins of the United States. Salt Lake City plays an important role in the climax of the story, both in the original video game and the HBO adaptation. When the game was released in 2013, Salt Lake City's inclusion wasn't the topic of much local discussion. But with the global popularity of the new HBO series, there's been a spark of interest in our city's involvement. As a fan of the story and a native of Utah, I feel compelled to overanalyze every detail of Salt Lake City's portrayal, a frivolous exercise considering this covers about 20 seconds of footage plucked from over 30 hours of content from the game and the show. I want to be clear about my intentions here. I might point out inaccuracies in the way that Salt Lake is presented, but I'm not here to criticize the hard work of hundreds of people. Adding touches of detail, using real Salt Lake City architecture and geography, means nothing to 99.9% of the viewers. These details were really added for Utah locals, and I think that validates a closer look. The Salt Lake sections of both the video game and the HBO series open on a desolate freeway, which happens to be I-15 North. In the story, they're traveling from eastern Colorado, and from the looks of it, they took I-70 through the Rockies and into Utah. Had Joel and Ellie taken I-80 through Wyoming, the trip would have been remarkably more boring, but that's a good thing in the apocalypse because you avoid all the ski town cannibals, and you save yourself a trip through Provo. As they approach, there are a few noticeable things right off the bat. First, this giant mountain that sits to the north seems odd. That's because the mountain that we're looking at doesn't exist, at least not in Utah. What we should be looking at is more of a large brown hill, which we generously call Ensign Peak. The other thing that's noticeable about their approach to Salt Lake is that these buildings are much closer to the freeway than in reality. As you pass downtown Salt Lake in your car, you can pretty much see the whole city out your window. I didn't know how close these buildings were until I started looking around on Google Maps. So as a credit to the visual effects team, this forced perspective looked natural enough to fool me. I guess if I had to nitpick the finer details of the scene, all these cars would be Subarus. As far as the buildings we see here, they are real buildings, but the story's timeline leaves their existence in question. More on that in a moment. Joel and Ellie make their way into the city and end up in this destroyed building, which leads to a fan-favorite scene where they run into a herd of loose giraffes. Sean Moody News on Twitter pointed out that this vantage point matches one from the KSL broadcast house. In both the game and the show, this vantage point overlooks a ballpark. There is a ballpark close by, about a block away at West High. It seems when planning the design of this scene, they moved the ballpark down a block to give the giraffes a place to graze. This change sadly came at the expense of Salt Lake's thriving parking lot culture. This is where I start to make up some of my own interpretations, but I think it's safe to assume that these giraffes are direct descendants of Daphne, North America's oldest giraffe who lived to be 31 at Salt Lake's Hogle Zoo. It's nice to know that Daphne continued to thrive in Salt Lake even after the fall of humanity. As Joel and Ellie feed the giraffe, we get some great detail into the city's skyline. Whereas the last scene had a very exaggerated mountain in the background, this mountain is almost picture perfect to the vantage point in real life. If you look closely, you can see the mountain ridge that leads to the living room, a popular local hike. This mountain and the overlapping mountain in front of it form Red Butte Canyon. We also get a nice shot of the Laza Hotel and Temple Square, which includes the Tabernacle, the Joseph Smith Building, and the church office building. Many people pointed out that the Salt Lake City Temple is noticeably absent from this shot. If you look at the current Google Maps data, the temple is under construction, and the scaffolding is replicated by visual effects artists in this shot. This is a great lesson for Utah in the opportunities missed as a result of indefinite construction. In the HBO series, the creators adjusted the timeline so the disaster happens in 2003, making the story take place in 2023. This means that the Crossroads Mall, the Fun Dome, and the original Delta Center still exist. It also means that the 99 West building at City Creek and the 111 Main building wouldn't exist, but it's pretty cool to see them overgrown like this. Usually, when visual effects artists are building out environments using CGI, they tend to reuse the same building models to save time and money. We can see an example of this here as this group of buildings to the right is used in the opening scene. Even though the first scene faces north and the second faces east, this entire group of buildings is shown from the same angle. As far as foreground detail goes, there isn't much to discuss in the HBO series. The interior locations are either non-existent or generic to Salt Lake City. This is the case with pretty much every city visited in the series. It saves time and money to be able to reuse locations and set decor. And once again, any more Salt Lake-specific detail wouldn't do much for the story. In the game, however, a few foreground details act as interesting Easter eggs for Salt Lake City residents. In earlier versions of the game, the buses are wrapped like UTA buses from the early 2000s. Also, the graphics displayed on Salt Lake City police cars are a near match to the police cars used during the 2010s. Years after the original release, the games would be remastered for newer PlayStation consoles. And for some strange reason, a lot of these details were removed, and I'm not sure why. These little nods to the city were exciting 10 years ago, and it's cool to see people who are new to the story get excited about the inclusion of Salt Lake now. I hope that, for the foreseeable future, these pieces of pop culture are the closest we come to seeing Salt Lake in the apocalypse.
It's got its ups and downs. You can't deny that view.